How does a poor Spanish shepherd boy, tending flocks in the hills of 11th century Castile, rise to become prior of one of Spain's great monasteries, only to be exiled for refusing a king's demand? What kind of prayer works miracles so consistently that Christians held captive in distant Muslim lands are suddenly freed, their chains falling away after families whisper the name of a Benedictine abbot hundreds of miles away? And why is this saint, whose monastery still stands nearly 1,000 years later, whose Gregorian chant recordings sold millions worldwide, after whom the great Saint Dominic de Guzman was named, almost completely unknown outside Spain? This is the story of Saint Dominic of Silos, the shepherd who became a miracle-working abbot, the monk who defied a king and lost everything, only to rebuild something far greater from ruins. In the small village of Cañas, nestled in the hills of La Rioja, around the year 1000, a boy was born to poor shepherds who owned nothing but their faith and their flocks. His name was Domingo, and from his earliest years, he knew the silence of the Spanish hillsides, the patience required to guide sheep through rocky terrain, the long hours of solitude beneath an endless sky. While other children played in the village square, young Dominic sat with the animals, watching, listening, learning to hear what the world could not teach him. Those years in the fields became his first formation. The rhythm of dawn and dusk, the vigilance needed to protect vulnerable creatures, the trust that God would provide pasture and water. All these lessons sank deep into his soul. He did not know it yet, but he was being prepared for something far greater than tending sheep. The same patience that kept him watching through cold nights would one day rebuild a ruined monastery. The same protective instinct that guarded lambs from wolves would one day ransom Christians from captivity. When Dominic felt the call to religious life, he traveled to the great monastery of San Millán de la Cogolla, a center of Benedictine spirituality in northern Spain. There, among ancient stones and chanting monks, the shepherd boy began his transformation. He professed vows, submitted to the rule of Saint Benedict, learned the psalms and prayers that would become his life's breath. His superiors recognized something unusual in him: a depth of prayer, a clarity of judgment, a steadiness that did not waver under pressure. Years passed. The shepherd boy became a priest, then rose to prior, second only to the abbot himself. He managed the monastery's properties, oversaw its finances, and guided younger monks in their formation. San Millán flourished under his care. But heaven was preparing a trial that would test everything he had learned in those quiet fields. The silence of the hills had taught him to listen for God's voice. Soon, he would need that skill more than ever. Around the year 1041, King Garcia III of Navarre cast his eyes upon the lands of San Millán. Spain was in turmoil, the Reconquista raging, Christian kingdoms struggling against Muslim Al-Andalus. The king needed resources for his campaigns, and monastery lands looked tempting. These properties, cultivated for generations by monks who had cleared forests and drained marshes, represented wealth that Garcia believed should serve his political purposes. He summoned Prior Dominic and made his demands plain. The monastery would surrender certain lands to the crown. The monks would comply with royal wishes. After all, was not the king the protector of the church? Did not his armies defend Christendom against the Moors? Dominic listened in silence. Then he spoke words that would cost him everything. These lands belong to God, not to any kingdom. They were given by pious donors for the salvation of souls and the service of prayer. I cannot surrender what was entrusted to the church. The king's face hardened. He had expected compliance, perhaps some negotiation. Instead, he faced a monk who would not bend. Threats followed. Pressure mounted. Garcia made clear that defiance would have consequences. Still, Dominic refused. The monastery's independence was not his to bargain away. Church property was a sacred trust, not political currency. The exile came swiftly. Dominic was expelled from San Milan, cast out from the monastery where he had spent his adult life, separated from brothers he had guided and loved. He walked away with nothing but his habit and his faith. Behind him, the monastery he had served so faithfully. Before him, an uncertain road through a kingdom that had rejected him. Yet even in exile, Dominic did not despair. The same God who had called him from the shepherd's fields to the monastery had not abandoned him now. If one door had closed, another would open. He had defended what was right. Whatever came next was in God's hands. The monastery of San Sebastián de Silos lay in the kingdom of Castile, far from Garcia's Navarre. When Dominic arrived there, his heart must have sunk. The buildings were crumbling, damaged by Muslim raids and years of neglect. Only a handful of monks remained, their discipline lax, their hope nearly extinguished. The church roof leaked. The cloister walls showed cracks. Everything spoke of decay and abandonment. But King Ferdinand I of Castile saw what others missed. Here was a monk of proven integrity, a prior who had sacrificed everything rather than compromise sacred trust. Ferdinand appointed Dominic abbot of this ruined monastery, giving him authority to rebuild both stones and souls. For 32 years, from 1041 until his death in 1073, Dominic poured himself into Silos. The work began with the most basic tasks. Walls were repaired, roofs restored, and fields cultivated again. But physical rebuilding was only the beginning. Dominic knew that a monastery without spiritual discipline was merely a collection of buildings. He restored the full Benedictine observance, the rhythm of prayer that sanctifies every hour, the silence that opens the soul to God. Slowly, vocations returned. Young men heard of the holy abbot and came seeking admission. The handful of monks grew to 40 and more. The scriptorium came alive with the scratch of quills on parchment, producing manuscripts that would preserve knowledge for centuries. And most magnificently, the great Romanesque cloister began to take shape, its carved columns and capitals depicting biblical scenes with an artistry that still astonishes visitors nearly 1,000 years later. Dominic oversaw every detail, not as a demanding taskmaster, but as a father guiding his children toward beauty. He understood that worship required worthy spaces, that stone and sculpture could lift hearts toward heaven. The cloister he built became not merely an architectural achievement, but a prayer in stone, a testament to what patience and faith could accomplish. As Silos flourished, word spread throughout Spain of the abbot whose prayers worked wonders. The sick came seeking healing and found it. The hungry arrived during famines and watched food multiply. Dominic spoke prophecies that proved true, discerned secrets of hearts, and manifested gifts that could only come from God. But his most famous miracles involved captives. The Reconquista was brutal, with both sides taking prisoners. Christians captured by Muslim forces faced slavery, sometimes for years, sometimes for life. Families were torn apart, husbands vanished, sons disappeared. Ransoms were demanded that poor families could never afford. Yet again and again, families who prayed to Abbot Dominic saw miracles. Captives held in distant cities suddenly found their chains falling away. Guards inexplicably fell asleep. Doors swung open. Prisoners escaped through impossibilities, walking hundreds of miles home to testify that they had prayed to the abbot of Silos and been freed. Others came to Dominic directly, begging help for loved ones still held captive. He would pray, and somehow funds appeared for ransoms, money that had not existed the day before. donations arriving from unexpected sources, debts mysteriously canceled. It was as though heaven itself conspired to answer his intercessions. The saint never took credit. Every miracle was God's work, not his. But he prayed with an intensity that seemed to move heaven itself. Hours spent before the altar, nights of vigil, fasting that weakened his body but strengthened his spirit. He understood what he had learned as a shepherd boy: patience, vigilance, trust. God would provide. God would protect the vulnerable. God would break chains that no human power could shatter. Throughout Castile and beyond, families began invoking his name whenever loved ones faced captivity. The shepherd boy from La Rioja had become the patron of the imprisoned. On the 20th of December 1073, after 32 years of rebuilding Silos, Abbot Dominic gathered his monks for a final blessing. His body, worn by decades of fasting and labor, could carry him no further, but his soul was ready. He had entered a ruined monastery and left behind a jewel. He had come as an exile and departed as a saint. His monks buried him in the church he had restored, and immediately the miracles intensified. Pilgrims began arriving, seeking healing, deliverance, and hope. Within 3 years, in 1076, he was canonized by popular acclaim, one of the fastest recognitions of sanctity in medieval history. The monastery was renamed in his honor, Santo Domingo de Silos. Centuries passed, and the miracles continued. Among the countless pilgrims came a Spanish noblewoman named Joan of Asa, childless and grieving. She knelt at Dominic's tomb and made a vow. If God granted her a son, she would name him after this saint of captives and miracles. Her prayer was answered. She conceived and bore a boy whom she named Domingo. That child grew to become Saint Dominic de Guzman, founder of the Order of Preachers, one of the most influential religious orders in church history. The Dominicans, who have shaped theology, art, and culture for 800 years, bear a name that traces back to a medieval Spanish abbot whose mother sought his intercession. The legacy of Silos extended far beyond its walls. The tomb became one of Spain's great pilgrimage sites. Kings and peasants knelt where Joan of Asa had knelt. Captives freed through his prayers returned to give thanks. Artists and poets drew inspiration from his story. The Romanesque cloister he built drew visitors who marveled at its beauty and sensed the holiness that still lingered in those ancient stones. Walk through the gates of Santo Domingo de Silos today, and you enter a living monastery. Benedictine monks still rise before dawn to chant the Psalms. The cloister Dominic built nearly 1,000 years ago still stands, its columns and capitals weathered but magnificent. Visitors from around the world come to see this architectural treasure, to pray where saints have prayed, to touch stones laid by hands, guided by holiness. In the 1990s, the monks of Silos recorded their Gregorian chant, expecting modest sales to liturgical enthusiasts. Instead, the album became a worldwide phenomenon, selling millions of copies, introducing modern listeners to ancient prayer. For months, chants echoed from radios and stereos around the globe. A medieval monastery hidden in the Spanish countryside suddenly captured the attention of the contemporary world. The monks themselves were bemused. They had simply recorded what they did every day, what Dominic had established 9 centuries earlier. The hunger for contemplative beauty, for something deeper than modern noise, had found its answer in their ancient rhythms. Dominic's legacy, it seemed, still had the power to break chains, this time the chains of spiritual emptiness that imprison modern souls. Why does Saint Dominic of Silos remain largely unknown outside Spain? Perhaps because another Dominic, the founder of the Dominicans, overshadows him in memory. Perhaps because his story belongs to a specific time and place, the Reconquista struggles that shaped medieval Iberia. Perhaps because December 20 falls amid Christmas preparations, his feast passes unnoticed. Yet his witness speaks urgently to our age. He defended church property against royal greed, refusing to surrender sacred trust to political expediency. He rebuilt from ruins, proving that patient labor creates lasting beauty. He prayed for captives, reminding us that intercessory prayer has power beyond our understanding. He lived the Benedictine motto, ora et labora, prayer and work, weaving them into a life that transformed everything it touched. Nearly 1,000 years after his death, Saint Dominic of Silos still invites us into his story. For those who tend flocks of any kind, whether parishes or families or businesses, he shows that early formation in humble tasks prepares us for greater service. For those who face pressure to compromise sacred principles, he demonstrates that exile may lead to greater fruitfulness than compliance ever could. For those who rebuild from ruins, whether institutions or relationships or their own shattered lives, he proves that 32 years of patient labor can create something beautiful enough to last a millennium. He remains patron of captives and prisoners, still invoked by those whose loved ones are held in bondage, whether physical chains or addictions or situations that seem impossible to escape. Shepherds claim him as their own, remembering the boy who learned to listen in the fields of La Rioja. Pregnant women pray to him, recalling Joan of Aza's answered prayer. And lovers of sacred music discover in Silos's chant a beauty that transcends centuries. A shepherd boy from La Rioja, a monk who became a prior, an exile who would not bow to a king's demands, an abbot who rebuilt ruins into splendor, a miracle worker whose prayers freed captives, a saint whose monastery still sings. The Romanesque cloister still stands. Nearly 1,000 years of weather and war unable to destroy what faith built. The monks still chant, their voices joining centuries of prayer that have never ceased. The pilgrims still come, kneeling where Joan of Aza knelt, where countless captives gave thanks, where holiness left its mark on stone and soul. Saint Dominic of Silos, the shepherd and abbot, exile and builder, miracle worker, and patron of the imprisoned. His story, hidden too long, speaks again to all who have ears to hear. In an age of compromise, he stood firm. In an age of destruction, he built beauty. In an age of captivity, his prayers set prisoners free. The untold story, the monastery that endures, the chant that still rises, the saint who proved that prayer can accomplish what no ransom can buy.